Good evening. Okay, so we're picking up with Obidiah, the shortest prophecy, the greatest truth. This is the overview lesson for it. The book of Obidiah is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. It consists of only 21 verses. But it carries immense theological and historical weight. When I'm talking theology, theological, that is the study of God or the study of all things godly. And there's a lot of weight in just these 21 verses. Its message addresses divine justice, human pride, the sovereignty of God over nations, themes that are central to understanding the text of the Old Testament. We see the sovereignty of God there much more than we do in the New Testament. And that's something central, and we're going to have several lessons in the new year focusing on the sovereignty of God and understanding what that means. Because when it comes to God's sovereignty, many people will say, okay, well, does that mean that God also created sin? Does it mean that I don't actually have free will and that God is kind of moving me like the Greeks used to think, like pieces on a board? And I really don't get to make any decisions and everything's already been predestined, especially because the Bible mentions the term predestined several times and in several different cases. And so we really need to understand the sovereignty of God, and we'll get into that more in the new year. But Obidiah speaks to that. Written by Obidiah, his name means servant of Yahweh, servant of the Lord. In this work, it's a striking example of prophecy, both in offering judgment and hope. Because remember, judgment has always been part of the picture, but God never just leaves it there. There is always hope. As long as there is breath, there is life. As long as there is breath, there is hope, right? And so Obadiah does that. Now, tradition attributes the authorship to Obadiah, but his identity is somewhat elusive. Because unlike other prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, there's no biographical details about him. It's just attributed to him. But the anonymity, that's actually not unusual for the minor prophets because it underscores the primacy of the message over the person. The message and what God is saying is more than any individual person. And that's true today. The message of God is more important than any preacher or any elder, deacon, or any member of the congregation. God's message, it is the supreme authority by which we're to live our lives. And so that is of the utmost importance. So really, not having any biographical details about Obadiah, it's not unusual, and it fits the picture quite well. Scholars, there's some debate to the debating of the book. Now, there's two periods here, and I'm horrible with dates, so I made sure to write them down. But the early one is around the 6th century BC. This is following the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem that took place in 586 BC. Or there's the 9th century. That was during the reign of Jeroboam. So you've got the 6th century or the 9th century, but all of these are BC. The latter view, the 9th century, kind of puts the property in the context of Edom's participation in Judah's suffering with foreign invasions and affirming kind of some things that we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 21 and 2 Kings chapter 8. But it's actually the former in the 6th century that's more widely accepted because it corresponds to the descriptions of Jerusalem's fall and Edom's role there that we read in Obadiah verses 11 through 14. Now, Obadiah's audience, this prophecy, it's primarily directed against Edom. Now, if you don't know, Edom, they are the descendants of Esau, who dwelt in the mountains, or is a mountain region called Seir. And you may recall the relationship between Israel and Edom, that it traces its rivalry back to Jacob and Esau there in Genesis chapter 25 and Genesis chapter 27, fraught with animosity between the two. And Edom's complicity in Judah's downfall had earned God's wrath. Edom had failed to assist their kin in their hour of need, and instead they exploited their misfortune. And the betrayal there is outlined in the verses 10 through 14 of Obidiah, and we'll look at that next week in the actual message regarding this text. Edom, though, is condemned for their violence against their brother Jacob and for gloating over Jerusalem's ruin. So the primary audience of Obadiah's message were likely the people of Judah who needed reassurance of God's justice amid their suffering. But Edom also stands as a representative of all the nations opposed to God's purposes, making the prophecy really universal in its application. In that it is, on the one hand, a condemnation of Edom and what they have done against God's people, their brother, their kin. But on the other hand, it's also uplifting for God's people in saying that God is still there, regardless of what's happening. A couple of key verses or key themes rather. Obidiah, he emphasizes God's commitment to justice, particularly those who exploit the vulnerable. You might think of Psalm 7 and verse 11, that he is a just judge who is angry with the wicked every day. Edom's downfall illustrates the broader principle that God opposes the proud, but he exalts the humble. You might just jot down Proverbs 16 and verse 18, as well as James chapter 4 and verse 6. In this text, it serves as a warning to nations and individuals who act arrogantly or fail to uphold their obligations. We can liken that to the New Testament, wherein we read in the book of Revelation, in those opening chapters to the 7 churches, that some have done all right. They have tested those that call themselves apostles and are not. They cannot stand this group called the Nicolaitans, but at the same time, we have one that is neither hot nor cold. They're just lukewarm. We have those that are going to have their candlestick removed. You see, Christianity, it's not just a name that we bear. It has obligation. It has responsibilities. And that has been the case always with God's people. Even here in the Old Testament, it expresses, as I mentioned, the sovereignty of God, his authority over all nations. But despite their earthly power, Edom and other nations, they cannot dissuade, they cannot shift divine purposes. It doesn't matter how evil the people are, it doesn't matter how bad the situation is, they cannot overthrow God. They cannot change what has always been in God's plan or in God's mind. And that theme, it's also in Daniel chapter 4 and Isaiah 40. It reaches kind of this culmination in the New Testament with the proclamation in Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11 of Christ's universal lordship. Or as we read in the book of Hebrews, that he is greater than Moses. He is the great high priest. He is the perfect sacrifice. So it's all building up to Christ. There's hope and restoration for Judah. Obadiah's message says that there is hope even in despair. There's an assurance of Edom's judgment and the promise of Israel's restoration, reflecting God's faithfulness to his people. That theme echoes again throughout the prophets. Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel chapter 37, and it prefigures this end times, if you will, hope that's found in the New Testament in Romans chapter 11 and verses 26 and 27. Everything leads to the cross. Everything leads to that final promise that one day, if we persevere, if we're faithful, and we run the course that's set before us, we will receive a crown. And though we will receive a crown, it is, as Revelation says, that the first thing we're going to do is lay that crown down. We're going to finish the course, pray and work that we hear, well done, good and faithful servant, receive that crown, and then lay it down at Jesus' feet. And we will see Jesus as he was on the cross. And everything is leading up to this. Obidiah singles out Edom, but the broader implications, they extend to all nations. The book's portrayal of the day of the Lord there in verse 15, it aligns with Zephaniah chapter 1. And Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 14 through 18, and Amos chapter 5, it's a universal scope. It's a great and terrible day of the Lord. It's a day of darkness and not light. It's a day of weeping and not joy. You see that, excuse me, in Acts chapter 17 also. A couple of key verses. Obadiah's brevity, it just being these short 21 verses, there is a rich structure there, and it divides into two main sections. So verses 1 through 16 is judgment against Edom. And then verses 17 through 21, though short, is on the restoration of Israel. The opening verses declare God's resolve to bring Edom low, emphasizing their misplaced confidence in their geography and their military strength. Everybody has always looked to themselves. How mighty am I? How great is my army? And what have you. But that's not a problem for God. It says there in Obadiah 4, though you build high like the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down. You can build yourself as high as you want, as great as you want, and you just have a lot farther to fall. God will bring you low. You will either humble yourself or you will be humbled. That imagery, Edom in the mountains of Seir, they had these mountain fortresses. And the most recent thing that I can liken it to, even though I don't really like the example, is you may or may not be aware that Hitler had a place that was called the Eagle's Nest. And the Eagle's Nest, it was high up in the mountains. It was only accessed by one road. Anybody could see you coming or going, and there was no other way up the mountain. And that's kind of how Edom's mountain structures were built, in such a way that they could see across the plains, anybody coming, days before they even reached them. And you couldn't go up many places because cliffs on each side. And so it was hard fought to get up there. And God says, from there, you can take all the comfort you want in this, but I will bring you down. And God asserts his sovereignty over their supposed invincibility. And Edom's sins are recounted with specificity, violence and betrayal and pride. In verse 11, on the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off Judah's wealth, you too were like one of them. You may have heard the phrase that all it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing. That's where it comes from. Is that all it took? Judah's wealth is being carried away, and by Edom not coming to their help, they might as well carried it off themselves. Obadiah, he universalizes the judgment, transitioning from Edom to, in verse 15, all of the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head. Whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. You see this. There's earlier decrees against human ego. Genesis chapter 11 and the new teachings in Matthew 7 and verse 2. And then the book concludes with a vision of hope. Like I said, God never leaves it in a bad spot, but portraying the triumph of his kingdom. Verse 17, but on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their property. The imagery of Mount Zion as a place of deliverance gives prophetic visions that we read about in Joel chapter 2 and Isaiah chapter 2. And if you're not familiar with those visions, just read those two chapters, Joel 2 and Isaiah 2, and see how they point to Jerusalem, how they point to Christ, and how they ultimately point to heaven. In the restoration of Israel, it entails spiritual renewal, territorial reclamation, with Israel inheriting the lands of the enemies. In verse 21, the deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. This is the last verse. This climactic verse reinforces God's ultimate sovereignty and mirrors the New Testament's of God's eternal kingdom there in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 16. The book of Obidiah, even though it's brief, it delivers a profound message of divine justice and sovereignty and hope. Its themes resonate across the entirety of Scripture, bridging the Old Testament with the New Testament, their portrayal of God's redemption. Modern readers, Obidiah serves as a reminder of God's unwavering commitment to justice and the ultimate triumph of his kingdom. And it might be that in the new year, we just take a closer look at the book of Obidiah and how it applies to us and what hope we have in God when our enemies surround us and take from us and leave us seemingly all alone. And I pray that as you go through this week, you will remember that you are not alone. As John Knox said, 1 plus God is always in the majority. The faithful Christian is never alone. A faithful Christian is never left wanting. We just have to have faith. And sometimes I question that. Not do we have faith, but how much faith we have. Because Jesus said, if you had the faith of a mustard seed, the smallest seed that there is, you could move mountains. What mountains are in your life? What mountains are you dealing with right now or that you might face in the week? And I'll tell you, one of the things that can help is if you just get it out of the way in the morning. It might seem like a silly exercise, but this has helped me immensely. When you wake up, after you say your prayer, before you say your prayer, if you don't pray in the morning, start your day with prayer. That's number one, okay? But just sit there and say, God, I know that today I'm going to encounter people that disagree with me. God, I know that today I am going to meet people who rub me the wrong way. God, I know that today I'm going to meet people who I would be happier if I had never met them for the rest of my life. God, help me to be patient. Help me to show the Christian love to those people that I know I'm going to encounter. See, part of the problem that we have with faith is we act like things are a surprise. I didn't know that person was going to cut me off in traffic today. You knew more than likely you were going to get cut off. I didn't know that there would be someone who would disagree with me today. Because everybody agrees with me, right? You might as well just get it out of the way and ask God for those things that you need. But if you're here this evening and you need the prayers of the congregation for patience, for strength or encouragement, then we'll pray with you and for you. We're not like Edom to Judah, leaving you off by yourself. We are here to help and support in any way we can. And if there is something that you need and it needs to be made known publicly, then you can do that by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.